Well, Senator Whitehouse, welcome.
Thank you
for taking the time to chat with us about climate-related risks and what to do about them. I know that's one of your favorite topics. As co-chair and co-founder of both the Bicameral Task Force on Climate Change and the Bipartisan Senate Oceans Caucus, we know you've taken an active role in protecting our environment. So I can't think of any senator better positioned to help us understand what is the appropriate role of our elected representatives to address these risks. Thanks for joining us.
Great to be with you. Happy to have this conversation. It's a vital one right now.
I couldn't agree more. So let me start with our national commitments. As you know, after rejoining the Paris Agreement, President Biden committed to the United States reaching net zero emissions economy-wide by no later than 2050. And his Build Back Better proposal included more than $500 billion aimed at implementing that commitment. Tell us, what are the prospects for a climate package that can move in that direction now? And what would you propose to get that done?
Well, we have limited avenues. The fossil fuel industry still exerts more or less direct political control over the Republican Party. So, and the fossil fuel industry has not yet gotten out of its oppositional stance to anything serious on climate. So that limits what we can do in the Senate from a bipartisan perspective. That does leave the reconciliation measure, but we still need 50 votes for that. So we have to work with Senator Manchin, Senator Sinema, and others who've expressed some skepticism about the significance of that reconciliation measure to make sure we have something that all 50 members of the caucus can get behind. At the macro level, Senator Manchin has been saying good things about the importance of climate. It has to be in the package. He wants to do something significant, but the devil on that is always in the details. And so the weeks ahead will do much more to answer your question than my prognostications could right now. But there are things that we could be doing in Congress that would make a huge difference. The biggest of all, by leaps and bounds, would be a proper price on carbon with an associated carbon border adjustment, so that the power of it was amplified by the tariff pressure on China, on India, on other low performing countries from a carbon intensity perspective to improve their game.
Well, we'll keep working at that. And we've got some headwinds ahead. For example, the surge in energy prices, together with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, has highlighted the challenges that we're talking about, achieving a path to net zero, and at the same time, having both affordable energy and energy security. Do you think those factors have diminished the political will, if it's really there, to pass climate-related legislation?
You know, I think there's at least as strong a case to be made that these facts illustrate the importance of getting the hell off of fossil fuels. This is a fossil fuel funded war by Putin on Ukraine. And if he didn't have fossil fuel funds to pay for it, none of this massacring would be happening. This is a fossil fuel war, and we don't have to have it if we move to a renewable energy economy. We've been through episode after episode with the fossil fuel industry where the American economy has been struck, where prices have soared. You can go all the way back to the gas lines of the 70s, and your license plate, you could, odd numbers one day, even numbers the other. This is a recurring phenomenon. At some point, we need to learn that this is not an industry that is conducive to safety and reliability of the economy. It's, crash after crash, episode after episode. And then the last point is that the price of this product is set by an international cartel and a ring of speculators around it. So the idea that fossil fuel will ever give us energy independence when the price isn't set within our country is just a completely fallacious notion. So I think what really happened in the wake of the war and the surge in prices is that the fossil fuel industry was able to deploy a very robust propaganda operation that they have that dwarfs all comers, and try to seize the narrative in that way And we bumbled and fumbled before we were able to respond, and until the press got to kind of think about this and realize, wait a minute, maybe this isn't really all that truthful, and look at some data and realize that they'd been misled. But I do think it made the fossil fuel industry feel pretty robust to have been able to seize the narrative so falsely and so quickly and so effectively.
Yeah. Well, we mentioned Senator Manchin a moment ago, and he's proposing that any legislation focused on solving our long-term climate challenges must be coupled with near-term efforts to increase the production of fossil fuels. So on one level, that sounds like an appropriate trade-off. Give some today, take some tomorrow. But on another, it's internally inconsistent. What do you think about that combination and that proposal?
We have two problems right now. We have a looming economic, environmental, and social catastrophe associated with climate change. And we have a dramatic strategic situation in Europe in which Vladimir Putin is using petropolitics to very strong advantage. To the extent, and just today he cut off a couple of European countries. I want to say Romania and Bulgaria, but
And he's going after Poland.
Poland and Bulgaria, exactly. Poland and Bulgaria. So, you know, we see this being used as a strategic weapon in real time. And in the same way that we did a Berlin airlift, you know, we may have to do a European fuel lift in order to allow those countries to turn Putin's petropolitics back against him. You know, it's kind of a stupid move on Putin's part because he makes money from selling the gas to Poland and Bulgaria. So when he cuts them off, he's making the calculation that his financial loss will be less than the harm to them. The more we can alleviate that harm, the more we can continue to put pressure on Putin and put an end to this terrible period in history that he has kicked off. So there is room to try to solve that problem and also to try to deal with the larger looming catastrophe of climate change. The problem is the fossil fuel industry is being rather less than candid and honest about how the things that they want actually relate to serving the needs of the European countries tangled up in, you know, Gazprom's web. And I think to the extent we're actually focusing on solving that problem, fine. To the extent that this is drill, baby, drill, roll those pipelines, and a whole bunch of stuff that has absolutely nothing to do with solving that problem, then there's going to be a lot of pushback, and that's not going to work.
So you mentioned pricing carbon appropriately, and many economists, including me, would like to see a carbon tax coupled with subsidies for investment in renewables. Do you think that can work? And how can we think about the uses of the revenues from the tax and the pay-fors for the subsidies?
Yeah, I think, well, let's start with the proposition that the International Monetary Fund has said that the fossil fuel industry in the US floats on a subsidy north of $600 billion per year, mostly in the form of pollution allowed to go unchecked and causing harm to others. So that's a really big number, and we need to address that. And it creates a wildly unlevel playing field against renewables that fossil fuels taken advantage of for a very, very, very long time. I think there is a remedy to that. It's a proper price on carbon, coupled with a proper border adjustment to both put pressure on the big polluting nations and to prevent cheating and free riding. So I think that's doable. That's part of what we're targeting in the reconciliation bill to try to accomplish. That actually creates lots of revenues, and those revenues will give us the opportunity to address, I think, two particular populations that are of concern. One is the environmental justice population that's been overlooked for a long time, but is now the center of the administration's attention. And the second is, the utility workers, the IBW, the mine workers, the labor folks for whom this is going to be a tough transition. And I think we have proposals in both of those spaces that I think will work very well. So the pieces to make this happen are actually all in place, have been largely designed and agreed to conceptually. It's now a question of trying to get 50 votes to make it happen.
Absolutely. Well, in a few minutes, we'll kick off our conference that focuses on the macroeconomics of decarbonization. In plain English, that is the impact on the economy of the transition. The transition, as we just have been discussing, is likely to be challenging and disruptive. As you mentioned, may create some people in need of assistance, some winners. What are some legislative and policy actions that can be taken other than what you've mentioned to ease that transition to a decarbonized economy?
I think those are the key ones. I think the quicker we can eliminate the negative externalities that the fossil fuel industry has pushed onto the rest of society, that's an unrestricted benefit to the rest of society. I think the carbon price that helps achieve that creates revenues that can be done to solve a lot of problems beyond just environmental justice and labor. There are going to be some regional issues, perhaps, where we can help with localities where their economies are heavily carbon-based and will take a huge hit. And I think we also need to think about foreign countries. I have lived my entire life in the shadow, in the afterglow would be a better way to say it. In the afterglow of the greatest generation's accomplishments, freeing Asia, freeing Europe, rebuilding Europe with the Marshall Plan, rebuilding Asia with the MacArthur Plan, and creating the American century. And that created a tidal drift in America's favor on a whole variety of issues. And I'm afraid that there'll be a receding tidal drift once the world is truly suffering the effects of climate change, anticipating the future effects of climate change, understanding how the poorer you are, the more likely you are to be hurt by this. And that America was very largely to blame, both for the emissions in the first instance and for the political mischief via the fossil fuel industry that obstructed us now for over a decade in doing what everybody perfectly well knows needs to be done. So we're going to have to step up and be ready to undo that harm and to be able to help support the countries that are going to take a terrible beating from this. I was just over the break in Palau and in Nepal, two small countries in very different geographic situations, one a small island nation, the other a very high Himalayan nation. And they share a common dread destiny that is already upon them from climate change. And it's going to be really hard to explain ourselves to countries like that when it gets really bad if we have not both stepped up big time on climate and also recognized that our benefit has been their harm, and we have to do something to try to balance the injustice. And
many of those countries were hard hit by the pandemic.
Yeah.
And many of them are heavily indebted, and their circumstances make it increasingly difficult for them to service, let alone pay off that debt. So
and
those
many
are real
of them
challenges.
have environmental benefits that the lack of development gives to the rest of us, and forests and things like that, for which we have not been providing much in the way of compensation or support. And many of them are dependent on oceans economies, where it's not just climate change and heat, but the acidification and the strip mining of the seas by the Chinese and pirate fishing fleets, and just general ocean pollution that is causing massive harm along relatively impoverished coasts.
Yeah.
We got some explaining to do, as Ricky Ricardo used to have to say loosely.
And some work to do for sure.
Yeah.
So
You got to make it right. That's what
we've
America's
got
all
the
about.
we've got the conceptual pieces of how to do this. So how do we build support given the obstacles that you just talked about for these policies and for this legislation?
There is a huge, massive gap that we can fill. And that is in corporate America's engagement on climate in Congress. If you set aside the fossil fuel industry, understand that they're hugely conflicted and are running a very corrupting operation to try to block climate action, just set them aside. The rest of corporate America is negative, net negative on climate legislation in Congress. There's a lot of focus on internal sustainability policies, which is great, and those are often very good. In some cases, they're pushing that sustainability out supply chains to reach more broadly. That's also very good. There's a lot of happy talk to shareholders and customers about climate, but it doesn't matter what your industry is. When they come to Congress, they lose all interest in climate, and they very often come to Congress through trade associations and industry groups that have been co-opted by the fossil fuel industry to oppose climate legislation. So bankers are dealing with the warnings from the central banks that this is a potentially $20 trillion crash when the carbon bubble bursts, and the banking industry is smack in the center of that. And the Bankers Association has absolutely nothing to say about climate. The insurance industry is looking at its core necessity, which is predictability, to be able to deliver its product, being so undermined that they can no longer provide insurance services in whole quadrants of the economy. The American Insurance Association doesn't lift a finger on climate. The tech industry takes no interest in this. They care a lot more about being able to import engineers and be taxed the way they want to be. If you add up all of the engagement with corporate America in Congress, it adds up to a very significant weight against climate legislation. And it's really hard for Congress to move given the amount of corporate power that has been created in recent years in politics, when corporate America is an anchor to drag for those of us who are fighting for climate legislation. Again, setting aside the fossil fuel industry, which we know is a very robust adversary and is going to continue to be, these are all the so-called good guys. And what they have not done is align their stance in Congress with their public and stated stance on climate. So it ought to be fairly easy to get corporate America to align what it says it wants with what it's actually asking for in Congress, but that has not happened yet. There is a huge gap between what corporate America tells Congress about climate and what it tells itself and the public about climate. And that gap needs to be closed. And corporate America needs to take climate legislation seriously, because there is no scenario where we get on a safe climate pathway without legislation. You cannot add individual corporate sustainability practices up and get to a safe pathway. You have to deal with the problem of the negative externalities and the subsidies and all that in order to make the economy work in our favor and solve this problem. And at the moment, they are not there. It is AWOL, shameless, bad behavior.
Well, there is increased momentum now for more disclosure and more appropriate and accurate disclosure that might help align those things. Are you optimistic about getting that done?
So far, the disclosure has not included lobbying and political influence. And I really think it should. I think a responsible CEO ought to commission an audit of their company's political practice in this space, because I think a lot of CEOs aren't aware of it. They send the check to the US Chamber of Commerce, they send the check to NAM, they send the check to their industry trade group, and then they go off and do good climate things, and nobody has sat down with them and said, by the way, boss, every time you send those checks to those groups, you are completely undermining everything we're trying to do on sustainability. And I think some formal accountability chosen by the CEOs to say, okay, get me a report on exactly what the hell this company that I run is up to in electioneering and in lobbying and in politics on climate. I want to have that audit done just as I should have an audit done on my financials, just as I should have an audit done on my compliance with regulatory requirements. And that would be a big, big step forward. And it's a shame that the regulators have not focused yet on that part of corporate transparency, because it probably is the key to success here.
We're talking in this conference about transitioning to a decarbonized economy. And I think everybody recognizes it's going to require time and resources. And it will also create winners and losers. And you've alluded to that a few moments ago. Do you have any other thoughts about how we best address those challenges, not just with compensating the losers, but more broadly, creating a society in which, we can embrace the kinds of goals and reduce those externalities?
Yeah, I think, first of all, a lot more transparency in politics and in political spending would squeeze a lot of the really nasty mischief out of politics and force a lot of bad behavior out into the daylight of, real accountability and proper citizenship and knowledge. So I think there's that overarching political problem of just way too much dark money sloshing around in our politics. I also think that we cheat ourselves a little bit because we look at the immediate costs, as you mentioned in your question. It's going to take some spending to move from a fossil fuel economy to a renewables safe economy. But in that process, the conversation too often focuses only on the costs of that transfer and not the savings and benefits of that transfer from the very great dangers that we're avoiding. And I think it makes it very easy to have false conversations and unbalanced conversations when adequate attention has not been paid to the $20 trillion risk that central banks have suggested we face from the carbon bubble, from the 2008 Great Recession risk that Freddie Mac has suggested we separately face, from coastal property values crash, from the danger that the insurance industry faces of unpredictability and therefore uninsurability, let alone the social and political risks of creating this much turmoil in a planet that's full of people who are pretty scared and angry already. So the question of global risk and identifying it and making sure people understand that out-year risk is really important, because otherwise you're like the one-armed accountant who only sees one side of the equation. And that's obviously a very false premise to begin from. So that's why it's so important that we focus on this carbon pricing risk and understand it and bake it into decisions and make sure that the downside of not doing this is clear to everyone. This transition is actually one of the easiest public policy choices that people have ever been asked to make. And the wins and losses are so much on the side of the transition that it's stunning that we're not doing it already. But political mischief has intervened, and we have not developed the body of knowledge as well as we should have of what the downsides are of failure.
Finally, we've talked a lot about, legislation, but there's also opposition to potential regulatory action about climate-related risks. For example, some of the opponents say that climate change is not financial stability risk, notwithstanding what the Financial Stability Oversight Council says.
Yeah.
And they say that regulatory agencies lack the authority to take any such action. And some even say that central banks, by getting involved in assessing climate-related risks, for example, have dropped the ball on inflation. And maybe there's some accuracy to dropping the ball on inflation, but that doesn't mean that they can't do two things at once. So Is there legislation needed to address these issues?
I don't think so. I mean, we have watched the fossil fuel propaganda operation go from climate change is a hoax to only look at the costs and this is something we can't afford to, we're interested in carbon capture and a few things, but we don't have to do anything really serious. Let's study this a little bit more. And then when it's regulatory, to this latest complete crock about how this isn't a real risk. I mean, if you look at 34 central banks, they're telling us this is the biggest economic risk that we face out there. And that doesn't include what Freddie Mac is telling us about coastal property values and what the insurance companies are telling us about uninsurability from unpredictability. So the idea that this is not a risk is just a flat lie. And unfortunately, that doesn't deter the industry from propagating it. I do think that it's clear that because of the fact of it, the regulatory agencies have the authority, and whether it's the Commodities Futures Trading Commission, which actually, believe it or not, even did good work on this under President Trump, or the SEC or the bank regulators, they clearly, I think, have the existing authority to do this. But when there's a lot of pushback from a big industry, regulators can chicken out. Look at Mary Jo White under the Obama administration with the SEC back then. This was all pretty clear back then, and she wouldn't touch it with a 10-foot pole. So I think this is much more about having the courage of understanding the facts and knowing what your duties are and using your authorities properly than it is having to give new authorities or anything that we would do legislatively.
Well, Senator Whitehouse, you've been generous with your time, and we value your insights, your wisdom, and your commitment to this process. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thanks for allowing me to join. This is as I said, it's a critical conversation to get right, and to get it right really fast because time's running out on us. So thank you.
Agree with that. Thank you.